Yom Yerushalayim Sameach. So we have here our flag. We should have a flag of Yerushalayim as well. But I'll settle for, this is a parsha that begins with the census. The essence of a census is to count the individual. The census divides the people of Israel into tribes, and indeed it focuses on the significance of individualism. Nevertheless, it is so important for us as a nation to survive, to have something that is central, that unites us all, that unifies our mission. And that was, in the wilderness, the Mishkan. But the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was a temporary structure. The final goal was Yerushalayim, Kodesh. And in the days of David HaMelech, we merited to conquer that city. And today is a day that we celebrate. We celebrate the fact that in 1967, after 19 years of having a Jewish state without its true capital, the Rabbi Milevsky was kind enough to return it to the people of Israel. It's interesting. We say in our tefillos on Yom Yerushalayim, Simcha le'artzecha, v'sason le'irecha, that there's simcha with the land of Israel, but there is sason for your designated city. Now, what's exactly the difference between simcha and sason? So one commentator explains, the Meshech Chochmah notes, that when you are happy with others, that is a simcha. When you are happy on your own, when there's some kind of event that takes place that you can't share with anyone, but you are extremely happy about it, the person who wins the lottery and somehow is able to hide it from the world, that's a sason. Simcha is with others, and sason is alone. At the times of the Bet HaMikdash, the land of Israel belonged to the people of Israel. However, there was a legal status given to non-Jews who want to live in Israel. There were requirements. You don't want people to come with their values, with their ethics, and corrupt our land. So there was an allowance, and we had a responsibility towards individuals that were called a ger toshav. A ger toshav does not mean a convert to Judaism. They do not have to convert, but they have to be ethical. They have to accept the 7 Noachite laws. Once they commit themselves to the Noachite laws, so we suddenly have a responsibility towards them. We have to take care of them. We have to go ahead and cure them. We have suddenly a responsibility, and they have the legal right to live in the land of Israel. However, the ger toshav can live anywhere he wants but Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim, a ger toshav does not live. Reason being, the city of Yerushalayim is the city that the nation of Israel turns to. You want to turn there, you want to be inspired by its educators, by the ethical people that live there. There are specific foods that you must eat within the boundaries of the city, because Rabbi Milevsky wants us to be attracted to the city there and learn and be inspired by the dwellers. We can't have the ger toshav acting as an educator. Okay? So Yerushalayim belongs just for us. So in the land of Israel, it could be simcha. It could be simcha. In other words, you could be happy and you could bring happiness to members of other nations as well. But in Yerushalayim, that it's a happiness only for the people of Israel, it is a sason. That's one explanation. But there's a little bit, as my father will give a little bit of a different explanation of what simcha and sason is. There are happiness, there are times that you feel happy that it's gradual. Okay? There's something that's gradual. And then there's something that gives you satisfaction and a feeling of fulfillment that is sudden. In other words, you drink a glass of wine. ever drink a glass of wine? It's not a sudden enjoyment. Gradually, little by little, things, you have a good 8 ounces. Little by little, things start getting blurred. You start feeling good. It's gradual. On the other hand, if you're walking on a hot day and you're jogging and you don't have water, and suddenly someone hands you a bottle of water and you drink it, that is, it gives you a chiyas, it gives you a life. Simcha is something that happens gradually. V'yayin yisamach levav enosh. It says that wine brings simcha to a person. That's what the verse tells us. Why? It's gradual. The sudden happiness that occurs suddenly, that is more like the water. V'shafte mayim b'sason. So that's the difference between the two. So now, with that, we could explain the following. Simcha la'artzecha. We return to the land of Israel. It was a gradual process, from Herzl having the vision in 1897, 1898, and the difficulties of the Aliyah, and the difficulties of the British coming, and us being so hopeful with the Balfour Declaration, and then Rabban Shalom, with his great humor, deciding to give oil to the Arabs right then, and suddenly the whole world needs it. It's like, what on earth, then you have to give them oil. They should have first given us a Jewish state, and then give them, or Bichlal don't give them oil at all. Anyway, Rabban Shalom has his plan, but it was a long journey for us to finally have a Jewish state in 1948. So it was a process. Boy, was it a process. It was simcha la'artzecha. On the other hand, did anyone predict here, beginning of June 1967, that by Shavuos, right, you're going to have access to the Kotel? Anyone predict it? No one predicted. Why? We had a sason le'erecha, was a sudden gift to the people of Israel. So simcha is the return la'artzecha. The sason le'erecha was a sudden gift from above, a different type of happiness, of excitement that indeed we merited on this day. So something to be mindful of. Something to be mindful of today, especially with the Parsha that addresses the importance of having something that's central to all of us, something that unites us. You could have people dwelling, you could have tribes settled in different places. You can have different philosophies in Judaism. We don't have to agree on everything. One person could say that the most important thing is Talmud Torah, and one person could go ahead and declare that it's important to go ahead and be focused on chesed. Another person could focus on tefillah. It's all good, but if we have something that unites us, and we go to Yerushalayim and say, this is a city that's important to all of us, then we are united, like in the Mishkan. Otherwise not. And that's what we can learn. But we're going to turn to the end of this week's Parsha, a topic we addressed already in detail once, but we'll have to revisit it because we have to add page 744 on the art scroll on Shvi. Now, the portion it's a census. We count the Levim as well. It is quite fascinating how small they were, number-wise. And then we turn at page 744, and the Levim are given, we are told to count, to take a census of the families of the Kohanim, of the Levim. Kohanim was very easy to count, because you basically had 3 Kohanim at the time. But the Levim, there were 22,000 of them. We are given their numbers, and they are given jobs. They are given missions and responsibilities throughout the years in the wilderness. So it starts off on page 744, chapter 4, verse 2, Naso. Go ahead and take a census. And Naso is also to elevate. But here it is to count, to take a census. Of the family of Kehat, Levi had 3 children. Kehat, Gershon, and Merari. So the first family is counted here. We are told that this is a count that is significant for the service that they are going to perform, and this service begins at age 30. What this family of the Levi'im do, the members of the Kehatim, In verse 4 we are told that they do the work of the most holy, but kodesh, things that are kadosh, kodesh, kodashim. And now, what they do is that they carry the vessels from location to location. So the way it works, in verse 5 we are told that when the camp is ready to travel, Aaron and his children, they are the ones that take out the partition curtain, and they are the ones to cover the holy ark. They cover it with a specific type of hide. And then, after they finish covering it, we ask the Bnei Kehat to do the schlepping. They do the schlepping. And that's what we are told. Now, at the end of the Parsha, here, there's a warning here. So if you look at verse 17 on page 746, there's a warning here that, listen here, he tells Aharon, be careful with the Kehatim because they are doing something that's very significant, carrying the holy items, but I do not want them to go ahead and see the vessels before they are covered. So you, Aharon, have the responsibility. You and your children should go ahead and do your part to cover the vessels, because in verse 20, they shall not come and look as the holy is inserted. They shouldn't come early into the area to start carrying. They should only approach the holy vessels after they are concealed. They should not see the Klei HaKodesh Kevala as they are inserted. Fine. So that ends this week's portion, but next week's portion, it continues in essence with the designation and the job of the next family. It's very unique, by the way, that you have 3 families, 3 jobs, 3 descriptions, and for whatever reason we decide to break up this week's portion and start a new portion in the middle. We do one this week, we take a break, we have Shavuos, and then we're going to have 2 more being described. The second family is the family of Bnei Gershon. They too come at age 30, and they carry things that are not as holy. What do they carry? They carry the Yeriot HaMishkan. They go ahead and they carry the curtains. Okay? They carry those curtains. And a few other items mentioned. And then if you turn to verse 29, Merari has a responsibility. What's unique is that when it comes to the first family of Kehat and the family of Gershon, we are told that when they are told that the census should take place, the Torah uses the word naso, which means to count and elevate. Merari does not get that. Now, Merari has the responsibility of the mishmeret. The mishmeret, an interesting word that is presented in verse 31. And their mishmeret, their responsibility, their job, their shmirah, their burden, is to go ahead and carry the karshei hamishkan, to carry the planks of the tabernacle. These were large, heavy wooden planks. They were given wagons for it. So throughout the wilderness, when they were traveling, they were the ones that were responsible and were leading these wagons. And that's it. And we're given here the jobs to the 3 families. And we ask ourselves, number one, why the division between the portions? Why does the first one, Kehat, get a Nassau? Gershon, the second one, gets a Nassau, but with a Gamhem. You know what Gamhem? They too. Meaning the real Nassau, the real term of elevation, the term of status was given to the first one. The second one, Gershon, gets the term Nassau, is presented for them as well. But it is only with a Gamhem. They too should have it. And poor Merari, who has to schlep these gigantic wooden planks, what's going on with them? They don't get a Nassau at all. Okay? What's this all about? Now, we know very well that our relationship to this Chumash, to this book, is much more than a book that was given 3,400 years ago that happened to be significant. But we view it as a book given by the Almighty, and since it is given by Him, it is in essence connected to Him. So we connect to the Almighty through it. And in addition, due to the fact that this Creator that we relate to is not limited by time or space, So therefore, this book as well is really not bound completely by time. And therefore, this book often refers to things that are going to take place in the future. There's a remez now. We could go ahead and find references to future events and perhaps even guidance. We have to be very careful with such readings. Meaning, when it comes to the halachic system, it is very easy to follow. We figure out what to do, what not to do, and we move on with confidence. If the Sanhedrin guides us, even if eventually we find out that they made a mistake, we could be confident because the Almighty gave us a green light to follow the guidance of the Sanhedrin. So when it comes to a system of what yes to eat, what not to eat, if the pot is kosher or not, there's a great amount of confidence. But when it comes to predictions that we sense in the book, in other words, the book talked about a return to the land of Israel eventually, right? At the end of Parashat, at the end of the book of Devarim, there's a return to the land of Israel. We envisioned it one way, right? How did we envision? Now we're going to be in the shtetl in Poland, and suddenly we're going to hear the blast of the Mashiach. And as Rabbi Milevsky used to say, that I prepare for the coming of the Mashiach by being sure that I have my button, the button that fell off my jacket, I asked my wife to sew it back immediately because I'm concerned that Mashiach will come and I want to have my suit ready. Meaning, preparing for the coming of the Mashiach meant to be passive in the physical, active in the spiritual, and we're going to hear the big blast of the shofar, and we're going to hop onto an eagle, and we're going to fly to the land of Israel. That was the vision that existed. Why? Because we have a text that indicates that in the future it's going to take place, and this is a book from the Almighty, so we have confidence. It didn't happen like that exactly. In other words, the person who predicted that Jews are returning and have a land, he had a long beard, but he wasn't exactly, Herzl was not the way they predicted or they envisioned the great Rebbe who's going to do it. God does it his way. The halachic system we could deal with, the system that predicts and tells us about the future is a little bit different. So bottom line is, this is a book that is given in the past, but it relates, and it's the history of the people of Israel too. Quite fascinating. Now, with that, it's interesting as well. The rabbis in the Talmud make drashot. They take one word of Torah, and they share with you an insight, and they share with you a source for a halacha. Now, when you read the text of the Torah itself, you have difficulty relating that teaching that is mentioned in the Talmud because it doesn't fit into the simple reading of the text. But nevertheless, the rabbis had a right to do it. And we somehow, and some commentators explain, that since in the future the rabbis are going to come up with that insight, it is as if retroactively it is in the text itself as well. So these things are very complex to understand because you're playing with a dimension of time that we don't really relate. We see everything as chronological, but it seems to be that the way the Torah works, there is no such thing. The Ribono Shel Olam knew the future, so therefore a reference in the future could have actually a hint in the Torah itself. And then there are those that go a little bit further with it. You've heard stories of people that found their own name, like the Vilna Gaon found reference to his own life in the Torah itself. That is a little bit more complex, and we don't work with that. But nevertheless, the concept is, this is a book that predicts the future of the people of Israel. And at times, we must use it and utilize the system to know that the time has changed. So remember that concept. When times change, when it's a new world, and this is a book that's going to prove that there are different eras, you have to make some adjustments with caution. And that's what we're going to address now. What periods are we talking about? So that our history could be divided into three parts. We could talk about the first temple period, the second temple period, and the Galut. Okay? The first temple, the Bet HaMikdash HaRishon. We had our problems. There's no question. We were fighting Avodah Zarah. My neighbor was pagan. Right? Not an easy thing. It was a strong attraction. Archaeologists are finding too many Avodah Zarahs in the land of Israel. And they could date it from the first Bet HaMikdash period, even in Yerushalayim, indicating that this was the constant struggle of that period of time. You know, we struggle with what? Sinas Chinam Lashon Hara. We have our struggles. Their struggles were spiritual struggles, meaning there was in the air, there was a sense of something spiritual. There was a sense that there's a higher being. They sensed it. But if there's a sense of a higher being, and it is complex to go ahead and always follow Torah, On the other hand, if I start worshiping this cute little idol that I could keep on my keychain, he has no demands, right? The keychain that I got from my Knaani neighbor, he has a great life. He's spiritual too. He can meditate and feel a connection to the spirituality, but he could go ahead and live any way he wants, and eat whatever he wants, and worship any way he wants. I have these limitations. So you could get your spiritual fix, you could get a spiritual fix by worshiping the idol. So there's always that tension, that on a good day, we went through a period of sensing that yes, spirituality is connecting to Hashem, and we listen to the teachings, and there are ethics, and we are concerned in the marketplace for the ani, the ger, the yison, the almana. We have a sensitivity towards society because that's what the Torah wants. Or at times we felt spiritual because we could go ahead and worship that idol, that small little idol, which they found dozens or hundreds or thousands of them. I could worship it, and then in the marketplace I don't have to be ethical because my idol makes no demands. He's a flexible God. That's the struggle that they're living with during that period of time. But when things were working during that time, and they were working for times, it was a world where we had all of Klal Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael. Right? We had 12 tribes in the land of Israel. They would get together. All of us would get together on the Chagim, Shalosh Regalim. And there's a verse in Bereshit that says, Velo yikahat amim. Yikahat means that ingathering. We had a time of complete Jewish ingathering. A time when we had the Holy of Holy functioning to the fullest. You know that there was a vessel, like an operating system. We have an operating system for prophecy. What is the operating system for prophets to connect to God? It was actually the Holy Ark. When we do not have the Aron HaKodesh in its right place, so we don't have a complete operating system, and prophecy is going to decline and eventually vanish. The vessel, the transmitter of prophecy, is the Aron HaKodesh, the Holy Ark that contains the Luchot. And we find Moshe Rabbeinu standing there in the wilderness. Where does he hear the voice of the Almighty coming from? After Sinai, when they are in Ohel Moed. Where does he hear the voice from God? From the Miben HaKruvim. The sound would come from on top of the Holy Ark. So the Holy Ark is still that voice of God when they had prophets. The prophets did not change Torah, but the prophets still guided them. So this is a time that they have the Holy of Holies functioning. They have the holiest items. They have the Holy Ark. They merit to have Velo Yikahat Amim. They have the merit of all the people of Israel gathering together. Unfortunately, at the end, and this ends period 1, period 1 comes to an end at the end of the first Bet HaMikdash, when the vessel, the Holy Ark, is concealed. We don't know where it is. Indiana Jones tried very hard to find it, but according to rabbinic tradition, it is concealed. Some say it was taken to Babylonia. Others say, and it seems to be the philosophy that is followed, is that there's a chamber under the Bet HaMikdash, created and built already by Shlomo HaMelech, where it's hiding. But the Holy Ark is no longer functioning due to the fact that it is not at its designated place, and therefore prophecy comes to an end. It was nivla, it was concealed. And the last section of this week's portion refers to period number 1. Period number 1 of our history is Velo Yikahat, ingathering. The tribe of Kehat represents the era of ingathering, and that comes to an end when the Bala et HaKodesh, when they concealed the Holy Ark. So the explanation given is that the 3 tribes refer more than just to 3 people and their descendants, but refer to different periods. The first period is the period that's the holiest, the one that when things worked well, they worked to its fullest, and that comes to an end with the vessels concealed. The second period, the second Bet HaMikdash, was good. Was not as good as the first Bet HaMikdash. It says that the elders, when they saw the structure, the second structure, the elders were crying. Why? The young people were all happy. We have a Bet HaMikdash. The elders who remembered the first temple were quite depressed because it was nothing like the first one. So it was like a secondary Bet HaMikdash, the second Bet HaMikdash was not as great. They didn't have prophets. Prophecy came to an end. And therefore, the second period, when in reality, we were like foreigners in our land. The land of Israel, when we returned in the beginning of the second Beit HaMikdash, you know how we returned. We got permission from Cyrus. Then we finally get rid of the Persian Empire. Who shows up? The Greeks. We get rid of the Greeks. Who shows up right afterwards? We even invited them. The Romans. So we were in our land, but we were like Gerim. We were like Gerim Sham. We were like foreigners. And therefore the second period refers to Gershon. They are like Gerim there. And they had an elevation, but it was secondary. So therefore the second period we are addressing is referred to here by the tribe of Gershon, and therefore in the beginning of Parshat Nasa et bnei Gershon, Gamem, they too get counted. But they're not as good, it wasn't as good as the earliest period of time. They are secondary, and there are many details that really correspond to those events. The third period is the bitter agolus, the bitter exile. When we are carrying the burden, you know, when my mother had an album. She had an album from her childhood. And she had a clipping from a newspaper. I shared this here already. Once a clipping from a local Cleveland newspaper. And she won some kind of prize. Why? She was at age 13, she was able to answer the weekly question. You know, they had the weekly question. You would send in an answer and you would get a prize, some kind of a free subscription to another boring Jewish newspaper. So she won. What was the question she won for? Where did the Jews have the wood when they left Egypt to be able to construct the tabernacle? Where was the wood from? And the answer was, how did she know it? She told me straight out that her father told her, but which is fine, that Yaakov Avinu Midrash notes, as they are going down to Egypt, Yaakov Avinu, they're on their way down to Egypt. He turns to his family and says, get some matzei shittim, go get some of the shittim wood. And we're going to take it with us because one day we're going to leave Egypt. And when we leave Egypt, I somehow have an intuition as a prophet that it will be necessary to construct with it something for the sake of God. So take the wood with you from the land of Israel and bring it with you down to Egypt. So they had the wood, so imagine the Jews come down, the Shidim Nefesh come down. What are they schlepping? Lots of things. When you come back from Israel, your luggage is full. People want, you know, if you have kids, grandkids want the specific Doritos or the specific gums, whatever you can't get. But they were schlepping wood, as I bring wine. So they were schlepping some wood as well. Come to Egypt, they had to rent storage area. Right? So for 210 years, it added up. They had to pay for a storage. But it was significant because children would probably know where the storage area was and they would walk by. And the father would say to the child, you know, the reason we have this wood here is because one day we're going to leave, and this is really, it preserves our identity. This wood is Eitz Chaim. It's really our life, because by believing in it, we believe in a redemption. So when they eventually left, they took the wood with them. It's a beautiful medrash, correct? The wood symbolizes that which keeps us alive far away from our homeland. Why are we here today? How were we able to survive 2,000 years being away from our homeland? No other nation can do it. Like here in Canada, by the time being, you look, there are many bumper stickers of the Philippines. It's been very, I've noticed it. A lot of Filipino stores, Filipino stickers, Filipino flags. And that is, they're all the first generation here. Especially today with the internet, so they still get their news from their homeland of the flooding or whatever they deal with there. So therefore, the Shidduch crisis there in Philippines, because there are no women, you know, they're all here. So they get the news from their homeland. So they're related to it. Now, what happens by the third generation? In other words, the Italians that came here 3 generations ago. Are they still following the news in Italy? Are they so concerned about Berlusconi? Not as much as the Filipinos. Not as much. What happens? You integrate. You become Canadian. You know, they dream also about the Maple Leafs winning one day. They have the same chaloimus as the locals. That's what really happens. You integrate into a society. By the 5th generation, there is nothing left. Right? Who came here? The Irish that came to Boston, to New York, the Germans who came to West Virginia, 120 years ago, there is nothing left. We, on the other hand, come to a country, and we could be there 30 generations, and we still have we daven about Yerushalayim 3 times a day. What is it? It's not just the prayer. No, it is the Eitz Chaim. There is a wood, there is the Torah that keeps us alive. The commitment to Torah, what kept us alive. And this is recognized even by the secular in Israel. Lapid, you know, the YouTube powerful speech he gave, a very moving one. A recognition, in other words, his turn, he recognizes that we are around today because of the people that committed themselves to Torah. Now there are new realities we have to adjust, and now we start fighting. But the reality is that we recognize this. We are around today because of Torah, the Eitz Chaim. And in the Bitter Agolus, in the Merari, we don't have a Nasa, we don't have that elevated declaration. We are not elevated, but we are carrying on our wagons. What are we carrying? What is the Mishmeret? What is Shomer? What is protecting us? Why are we here? Because of those planks, because of the Karshei HaMishkan, the wood that keeps us alive. So this is really a description of our history. But why is it so significant for the Torah to hint to it, to make reference to it? So without doubt, what the Torah is telling us is recognize that times have changed. Because when you recognize the change of time, you could make the necessary adjustment to save Torah. You know, my mother lived in Yerushalayim in the early 60s. She was there as a student. It wasn't so common, right? And even later in 67, it wasn't so common. It's not like today that these American kids go to these seminaries and still live in America because they're on the phones the full time and texting, and they're barely in Israel. They don't pick up a word of Hebrew, which is absurd, that they don't, you know, my oldest is at least in the Kerem B'Yavna where there are Israelis, so I'm very proud of him, I'm happy about it, but to go to an American school where they're taught in English is not as good as it could be. Right, my mother in the early 60s, she went and she picked up Hebrew. She picked up Hebrew. Why did she pick up Hebrew? Because she spoke with Hebrew, she interacted with Israelis only, and she speaks Hebrew like an Israeli. Now, she is there in the early 60s, and she has a lot of good stories from those 2 years she spent there. So one of the stories she shares is the time she went to visit Rabbi Sorotsky. There was a rabbi by the name of Rav Zalman Sorotsky. He was known as the Lutzker Rav. He was a Torah scholar. They named a street after him in one of the neighbors of Yerushalayim, Rehov Harav Sorotsky. I think it's a known street there. She went to visit him. Why did she go visit him? His son was one of the Rosh Hashivas in Cleveland. So she goes in as a 16-year-old. And she mentions that she comes into the Lutzker Rav. And he says, oh, come sit down, tell me a little bit of Cleveland. And there was some cake there, some cake and juice. And he says, Tochli mashu. And she says, I was young and stupid, she says to me. And I said, no, thank you. So he turns to her and says, Ma, at choshevet sheze lo kasher? You think it's not kosher? Now, that was his response. He had a sense of humor. Now, he wrote beautifully. His commentary on Chumash, was Naim LaTorah, became extremely popular, translated into English. But he has, in several places, he talks about the significance of chinuch habanot, of teaching girls, teaching women. And it sounds so simple to us, like, yeah, of course. But if you visit the Jewish world 90 years ago, correct? And you go ahead and you tell someone that I'm studying in a Beis Yaakov, in other words, or I'm sending my daughter to Beis Yaakov. There were many rabbis that would look at me in a critical way. Like, what are you, modern? Like, what's wrong with you? You're breaking from tradition. In other words, my Baba never went to a school. My Baba didn't, and her Baba never went to school. We have 2,000 years of tradition of girls not going to school. Who are you to break with tradition? And there were many rabbis that believed it. Among the Hasidim, several of them were upset about this idea of a school. And especially, even though they give the credit to Sarah Schneer for this idea, this advance of teaching girls Torah in depth, she wasn't the only one behind. There were German, Rabbi Deutschland, there were well-respected German Rabbanim that pushed it. And it was viewed as something treif, coming from the West, from Germany, right? So it was viewed as something that was awful. Now, who supported it? People like the Chafetz Chaim, people that sense that you can't go ahead and declare, well, in the past it was not done, and things were good, quote unquote, we make things much better, we were very good at rewriting history, everything was perfect in the past, right? and we didn't have it, so why make an adjustment? So the great Torah visionary said, you know what, you can't work with that system. You have to realize that if times change, and this is what the Torah is telling us, that if times change, the realities change. And if realities change, the Torah has to go ahead and be applied based on the new reality. Nowadays, it's the biggest mitzvah. The Lutzkerov writes incredibly in his Tshuvos. And he writes somewhere that in this generation, in my opinion, the Rav Sorotsky writes, and I wonder if people in Rehov Sorotsky know it, it is more important to teach girls in depth in this generation than men, than young men. He writes it, that Chinuch Havanas is more important in this day and age. And he goes ahead and he proves his point. Right? The most traditional of rabbis understands that the times change, realities change. Now, we have this attitude in our genes of a concern. In the traditional school, there's always a concern of change. Because when the new reality comes, adjustments are not always easy. They're not always easy to determine. It's much easier to work with a chazaka, with that which I've been doing in the past. There's a story, there was a rabbi in Navarda in the 1870s, 1880s, Rabbi Michel Epstein, a great halachic authority. And one day he's walking with his students next to the town, talking and learning, and he hears from far some banging. He hears some banging from a distance. So they walk closer and they start walking in the direction of the area, and they see people laying pieces of wood and putting on train tracks. The train tracks were coming to town. So he turns to Talmidim and he says, oh, here comes Apikoros. Here comes the heretic. And he said, what do you mean, Rebbe? He says, you know what's being built here? A train. And you know what the train's going to bring? A connection between us and the big city, the ideas of the big city. Here comes heresy, he noted. There was like a concern and tension that the train track will lead them to the big city, ideas from the big city, and suddenly you're challenged. You have to come out of your cocoon, you have to come out of the ivory tower and say, oh, how do I deal with the new reality? It's not always easy, and sometimes we come with ideas of the past and not realize that the Rebbeinu Shalom wants us to protect Torah, to keep it alive by addressing the new in the proper way, al-pi Torah, based on the guidance of the Torah. There's an incredible story of, the Gemara tells us, of Rabbi Elazar bar Rab Shimon. Rabbi Elazar bar Rab Shimon, the son of Rab Shimon bar Yochai, a spiritual individual, one day comes, the Gemara tells us that he comes out of learning by his Rebbe in a place called Migdal Gader. A place called Migdal Gader. So he's coming out of the study hall, and he's in a different world due to the fact that he was just spending time in spirituality and Limud Torah, and he meets a person. And the person says, hello, Rebbe. And he responds to this person and says, boy, are you ugly? This is in our Talmud, believe it or not. They say to him, what? You call me ugly? Well, if you have a problem with it, don't speak to me. Speak to the person who made me. Speak to my Creator. So then he recognized that he made a mistake. He asked for forgiveness. He followed him to town. So there's a story of reconciliation between the two. But what on earth does a rabbi say to someone, you're ugly? I mean, can you imagine that? Right? Is he out of his mind? Well, what's going on here? And the Talmud has to share this with us. Let's say it did happen. Let's clean up our case. Let's rewrite history. Why on earth is the Talmud sharing with us the story? You know why? He was in Hamad. He was in a place called Migdal, like a tower with a fence around it. He was in a different world, in the world of text, the world of ideas, and in the world he lived in, the world which was connected to a past. There is actually a relationship and a correlation between the physical and the spiritual. Just as you study in the Torah Mitzorah about a person who is flawed spiritually, so therefore it manifests itself in a physical way. That's how it perhaps indeed, or the tradition seems to teach that that's how it existed in the First Temple period. That there's a correlation. So someone that was good spiritually, his appearance, his physical appearance was perfect. So he comes out and he sees a person who is ugly, and he was still working with the old operating system. And he says to him, boy, you know what? You have a problem. You have a problem because your physical ugliness indicates a spiritual flaw. But then when the person, when he starts having a conversation with him, and he realizes that he's no longer in Migdal is no longer in that tower. He's no longer fenced in a different era. In this new world that exists, it doesn't work like that anymore. So therefore, he asked for forgiveness. He asked him for forgiveness. The idea of knowing and recognizing the new world. You know, what they celebrated a week ago, Lag BaOmer. No one's very clear about what exactly we're celebrating. But there's one explanation given, is that Rab Shimon Bar Yochai came out of the cave then. He came out of the cave. Why do we celebrate someone coming out of the cave? In the cave, he was a very spiritual being. He was, a Kabbalist, perhaps studying concepts of the Zohar, who knows what. But it is when we interact with society, we fulfill our true mission. In other words, recognizing the world and where it is holding, that's where rabbinic authorities have that responsibility. They have to somehow preserve the old, but adapt to the new, based on the guidance of Torah. Eras change. The Torah is telling us here, there's a Kehas era. But the Kehas era is going to come to an end. An end that would seem like an end of a book, an end of a chapter. You know what? If you lived in an era when there was prophecy, and the next thing you know is that your next door prophet no longer has clarity. And you know that for hundreds of years there were prophets who would look at you and know exactly what you are about and your personality and your strengths and what you could focus on. And then suddenly the prophecy comes to an end at the end of that era. You felt loss. You felt like all of tradition is suddenly concealed. And therefore this portion comes to an end because it was like an end for them. But God, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, you know what? There's a next week portion. There is also a Gershon. We can live in Israel during the Second Temple period as a ger. We could even survive a bitter exile of Merari. And Torah will still be there. You have to have, and leaders, the true leaders are the ones that made those adjustments to save Torah. Like a Rabbi Yisrael Salant, who was able to interact with people who abandoned faith. In other words, like I mentioned this story here in the past, having a grandson that wasn't observant. He had a son that did not follow the traditional teachings of Torah. He did not put an end to his relationship with that son. He had a different understanding of what religion and what Yiddishkeit and what is a Jew is about. And therefore he, in essence, adjusted to save Judaism. That's what the people like Rabbi Yisrael Salant, or the Chafetz Chaim, or the Lutzker Rav, they sense that with new realities, you make the adjustments within Torah to save Torah, because that's what the Torah wants. And that's why we are told there are different eras. And indeed, may we merit to see the final era of a return, B'mehera of B'yameinu, and may we merit that as we return to Yerushalayim, we shall return and see the building of the Beis Hamikdash, Meher of B'yameinu. Thank you. We'll see you in 2 weeks, God willing.